What's going on, everybody? Team G Sale back with another collection video. Yes, I'm saying another because I actually did one collection video. It was the, I believe, third video I ever released on this channel, and it was just focusing on my Lord of the Rings video games. I am now going to get into specifics with my collection, specifically going through each one of them. So I'm going to go and spend some time releasing videos on each individual collection, talking about the games that I started the collection with, some of my favorite games for the system, the state of collecting in my opinion for that system, and just my overall thoughts about the system as a whole. And I thought it would be fitting to start with the very first collection that I began my entire collecting journey with, which was the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
Like any kid who grew up in the 1980s, it was one of my first video game consoles I had familiarity with. Truth be told, I had an Atari 2600, but we only had a few games, and it was more of a novelty than something I actually spent a lot of time with. I received my first Nintendo Entertainment System from my aunt, who lived in the United States in Seattle, and a friend of hers worked for Nintendo of America and gave her some Nintendo consoles to give to her family members. And each one of the families got a Nintendo Entertainment System. So I got my first Nintendo Entertainment System in 1988 at the age of 7, and I absolutely fell in love with the system, and it remains today one of my favorite gaming systems. I still play games for it, mostly emulated, just because I don't spend as much time in my basement. I love to play when I'm kind of lying in bed as a way to unwind, but I still do turn on the NES quite often. My current collection, and I'm going to be posting pictures of the collection up on the side for you to take a look more deeply at what I have, but the scope of my collection is I currently own 689 licensed and some unlicensed games for the console. I began collecting for the Nintendo Entertainment System as early as, I would say, 1998, but I didn't get really serious about it till about 2005 when, getting towards the end of my university career, I had some disposable income, and I came across the Angry Video Game Nerds channel and was sort of inspired to go back and look at my original collection and start adding to it. I had what I always refer to as my original 10. So I kept 10 games from my childhood in a gray carrying case, which I have here. And those were the 10 games that began my entire collecting journey. So I'll show you those games and go through them one at a time. Most of them are games that I absolutely love and still are considered my favorites. And others are okay, and I don't know why I really kept them, but I did. Many of you probably grew up with this, and this is a standard gray Nintendo carrying case. It had the Nintendo label on the front, and it held exactly 10 Nintendo games. And this is the original one I owned from my childhood. And what happened was when I had moved to my first home, we went down into the basement, and I dug through my box of video games, and in there I had 2 NES consoles, a bunch of controllers and accessories, and these 10 games. And I brought them upstairs and was so ecstatic to start playing them again. The first game in here is an absolute favorite of mine, and this one is River City Ransom. Now, River City Ransom, I owned as a kid. This is my original copy. It was very much, in my opinion, kind of like a Double Dragon. It was a beat-em-up, but it had RPG elements where you can go into towns, you could upgrade your powers, you can buy all types of different things. It was made by American Techno, so it had a really interesting style to it. The character, there was a very comedic element. The characters had weird names, and they made funny expressions when they died. It was just a wonderful game, and to this day it's still one of my favorites to play. If you don't own it for your NES collection, I'd say it's definitely in like the top 20 you need to get. Absolutely, hands down, in my opinion. It's not, see, again, I didn't grow up with Double Dragon. We never really played it, but we played River City Ransom a lot more. This is an oddball one that I kept, and this is called Base Wars. Now, it actually has a longer title, which is, I believe it's Cyber Stadium Series Base Wars. It's baseball with very much kind of like a builder atmosphere to it. So, for example, you had mechanic robotic baseball players, but you can upgrade things like their pitch and different like speeds of their pitch and different items that they had. You would also fight people in the game. It was really weird and fun, and it was, again, one of the games like this one is interesting because if you looked at the side of it, you'd think the game is called Iron Sword, but it's actually called Wizards and Warriors 2 Iron Sword, and it has like it may actually be Fabio, I don't know, but it's got that stereotypical Harlequin novel guy on the front with his sword. And I remember this game being very awkward. The controls are really weird to get used to. I never played the original Wizards and Warriors, so maybe that's why I didn't have any familiarity with it. The game starts off with very little instruction. You're on a mountain, and essentially you're sort of scaling this mountain, fighting off enemies, going into doors, and finding items. It's a really fun game, actually. Once you get past it, it's frustrating at first, but once you sort of figure out how to play it, it actually is quite fun. This is one of my favorite games, and for whatever reason, it's really slept on for the NES. Like, people don't talk about it as much as I think they should, and that's Eight Eyes. This is my original copy. It's like, I don't remember how this happened, but it's got like writing all over the back. It's definitely not mine, so I must have bought it used. Eight Eyes is, I always call it like Castlevania with a bird. Like, it's a very strange game where you sort of can pick which level you want to go to, unlike Castlevania where you sort of just go through the levels. And you go through, you're fighting enemies. It's essentially a side scroller, and eventually you can use your bird to like to hit switches so doors can open. There's more of a strategic element to it. It's really fun. Like, I think it's a great game, and it's really slept on. Like, I don't think people talk about it a lot. It can be frustrating, especially like the mechanics of using the bird, but once you get used to it, it's really a fun game. And again, there's a reason why I kept it all these years. My favorite shooter on the NES is Life Force. Well, of course, it's Konami, right? So Life Force is amazing. It's a shooter. You get power-ups, you can upgrade your weapon systems, you're fighting all these sort of alien enemies in it. We played hours and hours and hours of Life Force. I actually got introduced to it by my uncle who owned it, and we would go to his house and play it. And I guess at some point I picked up a copy as a kid as well. And it's, again, one of my, what I call my original 10. This game is so much fun. It really is more of a computer-style game, but it was fun on the NES, and most people know this title because it is pretty popular, and this is Maniac Mansion. Now, I have my original sticker where I got it from, which is Video King on here. I must have got it when it went out of business, or I'm not actually sure, to be honest with you. And I'm scared to take it off because I don't want to... I tried, actually. You can kind of see in the corner, I tried to take the sticker off. I just didn't want to ruin it because it's my original copy. And so it's a point-and-click game. You're essentially... some aliens have taken over this mansion with the idea of taking over the world. You need to send... I believe you pick 3 characters, and you can switch between them to perform different tasks as you go through the mansion. There's weird things you can do, like put things in the microwave or go into this arcade. It's just a strange game. I remember having the Nintendo Power, and I was like looking at all the different rooms, and I spent hours playing this game. It was so much fun. Absolutely fun. I highly it's a game that operates better with a mouse. It's kind of iffy to control. There's a few scenes where things are timed, and it's really hard to get that going, but it's still a really fun game. The last 4 games are all from the same series, so I'm not going to talk about them too much in detail. And those are the Dragon Warrior games. So this is Dragon Warrior 1. Now, I'm a big RPG guy, especially 8-bit and 16-bit type RPGs. I never really got into the modern ones. Dragon Warrior 1 was an absolute classic for me. It was just such a fun game. It was a very simple RPG, a lot of level grinding. It wasn't one that you could finish like in one sit. It took a lot of time to beat it, but it was really fun. Now, of course, I have all of them in this series, and Dragon Warrior 2. Strangely enough, this is one that I never finished. I finished the other 3. Dragon Warrior 2 is very hard. Like, you can get your butt kicked pretty early in the game, whereas the other ones, there was sort of a gradual increase. Dragon Warrior 2 sort of changed things around where you actually had members of your party. You weren't sort of going solo now. There was magic, more advanced magic than there was in the original one. And again, but it's the one that I never finished, and I've always been wanting to go back and do it, but for whatever reason I start and I never complete it. This is by far my favorite, and it's Dragon Warrior 3. Dragon Warrior 3 is so much fun. I had the map that came with it that had like the 1,000 different weapons and items you can have. It's interesting because the map of the world is it's essentially the actual world map just sort of shifted around, and they have like Japan is Jiping, and England is Edinburgh or Edin, I can't remember what they call it again, but like things are very similar to it. Instead of Greenland, it's Greenlad. Like they really shifted things around, but it's so much fun. And at one point, spoiler alert, one time someone got mad at me about this, when you jump into the dark world, you're essentially in Dragon Warrior 1 all over again. So it's kind of cool. And last but not least in the series was Dragon Warrior 4. Very fun game. Long. It's split into like chapters, and I was recently trying to beat it again, and I got to chapter 3, and my emulator, I accidentally saved over the wrong state, and I did not want to go back and do chapter 3 again with Tulun because it just takes forever. It's so tedious. But again, amazing game. Tons of characters, lots of things to do. I love the Dragon Warrior games. They're some of my favorite games on the system. I liked Final Fantasy 2, but not as much as I liked... Sorry, I liked Final Fantasy, not as much as I liked the Dragon Warrior games. So for the NES library, my original goal was to get the entire set of licensed games, and it began way back in 2005 when I pulled out my original 10, and I realized something. I didn't have Mario, and I don't know whatever happened to mine. So I went on Google, and the flea market that I grew up going to, which was Mandalay Flea Market, was gone. But I looked up online, and there was a flea market called Thirsties. And I was shocked to find out when I went there that at least 3 of the sellers I knew from Mandalay were now at Thirsties. And I ended up buying Mario 1. Now, this was back in 2005. Games were cheap. I remember like most of the vendors had like $1 and $2 sections for NES games. So I went with my son, we picked up Super Mario Brothers, went back home, started playing Super Mario Brothers. Next week, I went back to the flea market and picked up Super Mario 2. I think I paid $5 for it. And I kept doing that every week. And before long, I had this gray filing cabinet. It was full of NES games. I probably had like 30 of them. And I thought, okay, I went online, I printed off a copy of what I think Wikipedia had for the complete collection, and I started grabbing games. Eventually, my wife got me a beautiful shelf, and we started organizing them. And then I remember at one point picking up some unlicensed games, some Tenjin ones, and I thought, hey, maybe it'll be cool to go for all the unlicensed ones and even the PAL titles. And at one point, I had about 20 or 25 PAL titles in my collection. But as the collection went on, I realized that I was having trouble getting some of those very expensive titles and very hard to find titles. And I was doing this on a budget. And I always say today, the most of these games I paid $5 or less for. The most expensive one I ever paid for, I spent $90 on Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers 2, and that was back in 2011 or so, which was a lot back then for NES games. And I've never spent any more than that. Currently, I'm missing... Depends how you want to look at a complete collection. I never considered stadium events in my peripheral because I just never was going to spend that kind of money. But if you want to include stadium events, there were 6 games missing from my collection, so I don't own stadium events. And of course, the other 5 are all the big hitters because I just never saw them. I was not lucky enough, like the Game Chasers, to stumble across them at the flea market or mispriced at a game store. So Little Samson is still not in my collection. I passed up opportunities to get it for $200 back in the early 2000s because I just thought that was insane. And at the time, it was. People weren't spending $200 on Little Samson back then. One of my favorite stories is going to a flea market in Minneapolis in, I think, 2004 or 2005 and seeing Bubble Bath Babes for $150, and I passed on it because I thought that was ludicrous that game was people were paying that much for that. And I really wish I had picked those up then because, we all know what they're going for now. So I don't own Little Samson, Stadium Events. I don't own Flintstones 2, Surprise at Dinosaur Peak. I don't own Panic Restaurant, Bubble Bobble 2, and Bonk's Adventures. So, of course, the 5 like big hitters. The most expensive game I probably own would be like maybe Power Blade 2. I don't follow the prices as much. So at the time when I stopped collecting for the NES about 5 years ago, that was probably my most expensive game, but I know things shift all the time. I've given up on the NES, so what I mean by that is I'm not actively collecting for it anymore. I mean, if I end up obviously finding one of these games for cheap, I'll do it, but I've sort of set my sights on completing other collections, and I've sort of left the NES for another day. If it was just like Little Samson I needed, I might have been willing to go and get it. But because I need 5 of these titles and they're all still relatively expensive, I'm just not in the market for them at the moment, but maybe one day I will be. But I'm still very proud of my NES collection, and recently I did liquidate most of my unlicensed games, and I also did trade all of my PAL titles a while back to a friend of mine to pick up some really rare titles like Kid Clown, Wayne's World, Die Hard, and Wacky Races. Those were 4 big hitters I was probably never going to buy on my own, so I traded some PAL titles for them. Most of the PAL titles I got off eBay, and they were all from sale, so I would sell something, money would go in PayPal, I'd buy a PAL title, and I ended up getting quite a few of them for relatively cheap. That being said, the NES is still one of my favorite consoles. I'll go over the actual consoles and accessories I have in another video, but I wanted to keep this one relatively simple and just focus on it. It doesn't seem to be nearly as valuable as it once was. The prices have definitely come down on a lot of games. There was a heyday about 5 years ago, maybe even less, when Little Samson was going for like $2,000, and some of these games were really up there. But it looks like the trend is sort of trending downwards for the NES. I thought about selling at one point, but I just can't do it. There's just so much history. It was the first system that I collected for, and it's still one of my prized collections. As you can see behind me, I have found these beautiful IKEA shelves. They don't make them anymore, but they fit perfectly the 689 games, or roughly. I have a few unlicensed ones that aren't in there. Some oddities I have too are the Aladdin Deck Enhancer games. I'll show some separate pictures of these as well. I have Maxi 15 and some other random titles. I kept all my Wisdom Tree games just because the Bible games are really kind of quirky and interesting. And I have some weird label variants like the red label Blades of Steel. But that's really it. In terms of talking about like a top 5 game list or something, I'll do that another time. This was just to give you an overview of what my collection is, a little bit of history behind the collection, and some of my original favorite games that I kept. Games like Zelda and Contra and Mario, obviously I played those as kids. For whatever reason, I traded them, sold them, or lost them. I don't know. There were a lot of other games I owned too, like Friday the 13th, and I really don't know whatever happened to them, to be honest with you. Like most of us, our parents might have got rid of them, or I failed to bring them with me when I moved, and who knows what ended up happening to them. If you watch my pickup video that's going to be coming out next, there's a really interesting box that my mom found in her house from one of my childhood games. So either way, thank you guys for tuning in. It was amazing. Please subscribe to the channel if you already haven't. I'm 5 subscribers away from getting to 200, and I'll be doing my free 200 game giveaway. Please like and comment. And what was your favorite NES game? When did you start? Do you collect NES? How many NES games do you have? Or what are your thoughts on collecting for NES these days? My next collection video is going to be on Super Nintendo, and I'm going to work my way from there. This is not my biggest collection. It is my second biggest collection. I've surpassed it a few years ago with another system, which I will do another video on another day. But again, guys, stay safe, have a great time, and we'll talk to you soon with the next video. See you soon.